Creativity is the ability to modify self-imposed constraints. In this lecture, we will explore the factors that get in the way of our creativity, beginning with those that are internal and moving to the external. Let's look at a classic example of self-imposed constraints. It's called the 9-dot problem. So we have 9 dots, 3 rows of 3 dots in each row. The challenge is to connect all 9 dots with 4 straight lines, 4 continuous lines. Once you begin writing your answer, you're not to pick your pen up and move it. It's 4 continuous lines. Now, if this isn't familiar to you, I suggest that you try it. And then when you're ready, come back. Let's look at the answer to the 9-dot problem. In order to solve this problem, we have to move outside of a perceptual block we create for ourselves. So we start in the top right corner and we draw a line across through the first 3 dots, extending outside of the box that we often create for ourselves, this imaginary box. Then we create a diagonal line, again extending outside of the box. Then the 4th line goes straight up, meeting the dot where we originally started. And then another diagonal line to the last dot. That's the 4-line solution, and that's the standard solution, and it's very familiar to many of us. But there are other solutions to the 9-dot problem. In fact, there's a 3-line solution. Think about that. How can you connect these 9 dots with 3 straight lines? If you want to pause and try it out for yourself, go ahead. Here's the answer to the 3-line solution. You have to imagine that the dots are circles and that the lines can pass through these circles at different points. Again, we start from outside of the 9 dots. We draw a line that touches the top portion of the first circle, passes through the middle of the next circle, and then the bottom of the 3rd circle, continuing on, and then eventually coming back and following the same pattern for the next 3 dots, touching the top, the middle, and the bottom of those circles, and then returning once more, passing through the 3 dots, the 3 circles, in the same way, touching the top, passing through the middle, and then the bottom of the 3rd circle. Now, there's even a 1-line solution. How might you connect all 9 dots with 1 line? Think about that. What self-imposed constraint might you be placing on yourself? Well, the answer to the riddle with 1 line is to think about the width of the line. We can connect all 9 dots with 1 very wide line. As we do this 9 dots problem, it begins to reveal to us self-imposed constraints. In order to solve the problem with the 4 lines, we have to be able to go outside of the box. With 3 lines, we have to think about the dots more as circles, passing through the center. And with the 1-line solution, we have to challenge the self-imposed constraint of forgetting about the thickness of the line. We tend to think about lines as narrow. Tools for deliberate creativity move creativity beyond chance to creativity on demand. This will likely be useful for you in the future to overcome blocks, to be sure. There are many deliberate tools that you've learned already that will help to overcome potential barriers and blocks in the future. In this lecture, we look at other strategies for overcoming blocks. Information from neuroscience, how the brain works, gives us insights into how these strategies help to overcome these blocks. Internal blocks happen in our minds. We're going to start with these blocks. We're going to look at 3 particular blocks to creative thinking. One is perceptual. This is rigidity in terms of how we see things. The next is habitual blocks. These are fixed patterns that we might get into. And then the 3rd block we'll look at is mental blocks. That's when the idea is elusive to us. Our creativity just doesn't seem to come. the wellspring has dried up. Then we'll present strategies for overcoming each of these blocks. Let's look at perceptual blocks. Perceptual blocks are getting locked into viewing things in a familiar way. The 9-dot example is perfect in terms of illustrating this, making it difficult to see something in a new or different way. In that example, we get locked into the shape of the box created by the 9 dots. There are 3 consequences to this block. One is jumping to premature solutions, not seeing other possibilities. The next is limited flexibility in seeing alternative solutions, which is also known as functional fixity, seeing something as if it could only be used for one purpose and not seeing other potential in terms of how that might be used. Here's a classic example. It's called the Duncker candlestick problem. Imagine that you're presented with this material, a box of thumbtacks, box of matches, and a candlestick. In this case, a small candle. The task is to use these objects to attach the candle to a cork wall, a cork bulletin board. To attach it to the wall in such a way that when you light the candle, it doesn't drip wax onto the floor. Think about that. How would you do that? You've got thumbtacks in a box, you have a box of matchsticks, you have one candle. Now, the solution pushes on an ability to not get caught in functional fixity, to shift your perspective. You see, in order to solve this problem, you have to look at the box that contains the thumbtacks not just as a container, but you have to be able to see it as something else, that it can be used for another purpose. You see, it becomes the platform upon which you set the candle, and then you use the thumbtacks to attach it to the wall. When most people try to solve this problem, they see the container, they see the box only as something to hold thumbtacks. They don't see another purpose, another potential, another possibility. Perceptual blocks. When we get caught in a perceptual block, we fail to get an accurate picture of our environment. We may miss opportunities. The school teacher or a parent who has restricted view of a child and misses his or her talents. A salesperson who successfully sells a product to someone but doesn't recognize other needs which could have led to more sales. Let's move to the next example of the kinds of blocks we might run into. Great creators use simple habits, even very strange habits, to get themselves going. But an habitual habit, a habitual way of thinking, can interfere with our creativity. You may know the old saying in terms of a definition of insanity is doing things the same way and expecting different results. As a consequence of this block, getting into habitual ways of thinking, well, we may not change. We go down the same pattern again and again. And when conditions in our environment change, we run the risk of becoming extinct. We see this with organizations. Kodak, for example, having created digital photography, but failing to see the potential in that. They were wedded to old film photography. When you become wedded to a routine, you reject new opportunities, like Kodak did, or you simply don't see the opportunities. Here's an example. I'm going to bring up a series of numbers in a column, and I'd like you to add these numbers as you go through this exercise. Now, for those of you listening, I'll give a verbal description afterwards. So again, here's the exercise. I'm going to bring up a number, and then I'll slowly bring up a series of numbers. As each number appears, you're to think in your mind of the total, the sum. So the first number is 1,000. I'll bring up a number of numbers now, a series of numbers, and you add them in your mind, thinking of the total. So the total would be, and the total, 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 the total, and the final total. Now, what happened here? What happened here, if you're like most people, when I bring these numbers up, you come up with an answer of 5,000. But the real solution is 4,100. Let me explain this. Let's look at what happened here. I presented a series of numbers in an order that creates a pattern. The order is 1,000 is presented first, then 40, then another 1,000, then 30, then 1,000, then 20, then 1,000, and then 10. Because of this order, your mind is focused on two-digit places, because these are the numbers that are changing, thousands and tens. The pattern of the sums after the first number 1,000 is 1,040, 2,040, 2,070, 3,070, 3,090, and then 4,090. Now, here's where the pattern changes. With the number 10, when we add that in, we have a new piece of information. We have the hundredths place. Our mind hasn't dealt with that piece of information yet. We've only worked with tens and thousands. We've got into a pattern in a very short order. So what happens? Well, if you're like most people, 99% of us ignore that. They ignore that new piece of information, the hundredths place, and they round up to 1,000, to 5,000 specifically. Let's look at the next block, moving away from patterns and to that moment when the aha, the idea simply just doesn't come. Think of the classic writer's block, where you struggle to find the solution. You can't break through. The idea that you want so desperately just isn't coming. The consequence of this block is frustration, emotional hijack, derailing yourself even further from your goal of creating. The wellspring of creativity dries up and we lose confidence as another consequence of this kind of mental block. Neuroscience shows us that we can literally engage in activities that alter our brain function. This improves the probability of coming up with a breakthrough. The strategies aren't new. In fact, humans have experimented and developed these over centuries. But neuroscience now gives us some sense for why they work. The successful strategies I'll share with you follow these three words, or these three Ds, if you will: defer judgment, defocus, and distance. We can use these three strategies to help combat the blocks that I just described. Let's look at how neuroscience helps us to understand how defer judgment, defocus, and distance work. So defer, when we defer our judgment, we're opening up our minds. When we improvise, for example, we find that individuals who are good at improvising are turning down their self-monitoring brain. People who are good divergent thinkers are turning down their self-monitoring brain, the prefrontal cortex. You see, that serves as a gatekeeper, a bouncer at the door that stands between our rational and irrational thinking. So by deferring judgment, we open up new thoughts and new ideas and new possibilities. The next is defocus. When you slow your brain down, we allow it to mind wander. Your thinking literally occurs along different neural networks, which allows for new pathways to be explored and new combinations of ideas. Let's look at distancing as a neural strategy, if you will. Distancing is stepping away, shifting from vertical to lateral thinking, forcing connections, deliberately introducing a new stimulus into our thinking, and that stimulus can then act as a springboard. Now, I'm going to share 5 specific strategies that you can employ that are based on these 3 Ds, the things that we can borrow from neuroscience. They all tap into one or more of these 3 Ds. The first is to vary your routine. Research shows that even slight changes, how to make a sandwich, if you make a ham sandwich in a different way, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in a different way from what you typically do, can improve divergent thinking by 10 to 15%. This creates new connections for us when we vary our routine. But you do need to be cautious. Varying your routine during work, well, such changes can also be distracting. Einstein famously wore the same clothes. Charles Schulz ate the same ham sandwich with a glass of milk. Let's look at the next strategy. The next strategy is to take an incubation break. One of the first deliberate descriptions of the creative process came out in the 1920s by a gentleman named Graham Wallas. He had a 4-step model of the creative process. The 4 steps in this process were preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. Let me describe each step. Preparation is when the problem presents itself to you. You become familiar with your domain or the problem area. You're preparing your mind to understand the ins and outs of the problem that you're trying to deal with. Incubation is when you go away from the problem. Where do you get your best ideas? Where are you? What are you doing when you get your best ideas? When I ask people in the audiences I work with this question, the responses I generally get are, well, when I'm running, when I'm brushing my teeth, when I'm shaving, just before falling asleep, while I'm driving my car. These are all examples of taking an incubation break. In preparation, we're working hard on trying to get to that breakthrough. We're understanding what the challenges are. But often we move away from the problem, and it's during this time of incubation that the idea presents itself, which is the 3rd step in the Wallas process, illumination. It's when you're shaving or driving and suddenly that light bulb goes on. The idea presents itself to you. But the process doesn't end there. There's a 4th step to the Wallas model, verification. It's then taking the idea and testing it to see if it works. When I look at writers and composers as they're described in the book Daily Rituals, while they had great variety in the rituals that they created for themselves, there seemed to be one thing that was consistent, and that is many of the rituals included some kind of incubation break. Here are some examples of the different kinds of incubation breaks that are featured in this book and the work of these superstar creators. Some enjoyed taking a walk. In fact, that seemed to be the most popular way to take an incubation break. Beethoven, Kierkegaard, Freud, Carl Jung, Strauss, Faulkner, John Adams, Tchaikovsky, Henry James, all took daily walks. Swimming was also mentioned. Gustav Mahler and Hemingway swam almost every day. Here are some other examples. Crossword puzzles. Maya Angelou and W.H. Auden used crossword puzzles to give their minds a break. Here's an interesting one. John Cage and Morton Feldman, when they needed to take a break, would copy work that they created previously, which allowed them to relax in a way. They weren't continuing to push for creativity, but they were taking a break from that creative idea generation work. Woody Allen provides another example for different activities for taking an incubation break. He would pace on his terrace, change rooms, or take a shower. Research shows us that the best kind of incubation break to take is to take a break that involves a non-demanding task. A recent research study looked at 3 kinds of incubation breaks. Participants were given a divergent thinking task to work on. And partway through that task, they were given a break. In some cases, they went to another cognitive task that was demanding, building something, let's say. Another group went to a non-demanding task, like sorting things, sorting bricks into Legos, let's say, into different colors, into piles of different colors. Pretty low demanding task. And then a third group simply rested. Now, at the end of this, they went back to working on the divergent thinking task. And what they found was the individuals who worked on the low cognitive demanding task did significantly better than the other 2 groups. So the kinds of breaks, the kind of incubation time that works best seems to be times when our body is occupied, but our mind is able to wander. In this way, our prefrontal cortex is less active. We're not evaluating. The brakes aren't on our thinking. Instead, the brakes are off. Our minds are wandering and finding new neural pathways. And in this way, we create new connections. Speaking of connections, that's the third strategy for overcoming internal blocks, when the aha doesn't come to you, when you can't get that idea. So the third strategy is forced connections. You can also think about it as the Spielberg solution. You see, Spielberg, when he runs out of ideas, he has a large canvas, an original painting of Norman Rockwell above his desk. And when he has that writer's block, he reports, he looks at that painting and he uses that painting, that visual, as stimulation. Now, you've learned some tools that help you to do this, tools in this course. Visually identifying relationships, where we take photographs and we look at photographs to stimulate our thinking. Random word entry, where we choose a word randomly and we force it into our thinking. Again, these kinds of tools, they shake our thinking up. They require our minds to take a new route. So you can use deliberate distancing tools such as this that shift your focus. And you can use springboards such as objects and photographs. This allows, again, your mind to travel along new neural pathways. And it reinforces deferral of judgment. Here's the fourth strategy, and one that I use, I must tell you, on a regular basis. It's called in and out note-taking. Have you ever noticed that when you're in a meeting, that your mind wanders, that you might start to think about something that you have to do, or you start recalling the items that you had forgotten about on your to-do list, or something that you forgot to bring to work, or you remember suddenly, gosh, I have to pick up eggs on the way home. This is natural for our minds to wander. In this tool, in and out note-taking, we take advantage of what our minds naturally do. It's a simple tool. The way it works is, when you're in a meeting, you draw a line down the center of your piece of paper that you're taking notes on, or if you're using a computer, you create a Word document that has 2 columns in it. The left column we label our in thoughts. The in thoughts are the notes that we take that are directly related to the content, the things that we want to remember. In the right column, we label this out thoughts. Here's where we capture the connections we're making, those random thoughts, those thoughts that get spurred perhaps by what's being said in the meeting. Have you ever had that experience where you're lying in bed at night or just before you're falling asleep and you have this idea and it's so brilliant you think you'll remember it and you don't write it down. Or you're doing some activity and you have this breakthrough idea, the light bulb turns on, and you don't take the time to capture it, and then later when you try to recall it, it's gone. Well, in-and-out note-taking is designed to overcome that challenge, overcome that problem. One of the biggest benefits of in-and-out note-taking is it helps us to tune into what's happening in our minds, this natural mind wandering that happens. And it helps us to keep track of those new ideas that present themselves to us. It's a way of keeping track of your creativity. Let's look at the fifth solution. I refer to it as the Hemingway solution, because what Hemingway would do is he would work through his writer blocks. And he would only stop when he knew where he would start, when he began next to write. He never finished with the writing block. He didn't walk away when he had a writing block. He would, again, push through it. And when he got to a point where he was picking up momentum again, where he knew where he would start next, as he would say, when he still had some juice left in him, that's when he would stop. Let's now look at some work out of the Harvard Business School, work by Teresa Amabile, who's looked at more external killers to creativity. She has more than a decade plus of research that highlights a range of creativity obstacles. Here are a few examples of her creativity blocks or killers, and I will refer to these as external because they are situational. But then they influence us internally, especially in that they undermine our intrinsic motivation. Now, all of these examples that I share with you are supported by solid, rigorous empirical research. Expected evaluation. This is when you know your ideas or products will be judged by others. The creator then becomes preoccupied by future evaluation. Rather than doing his or her most creative work, they focus on pleasing others. This moves the focus from doing the task for pure pleasure to doing it for external reasons. Next, she talks about competition. Competition is good, right? Wrong, not when it comes to creative work. When we compete, we start to focus on others versus the work that we're doing. It makes us do things quickly, thus less likely to pursue other options and explore. It focuses us on winning, less likely, as a result, to try something original when the outcome is unknown. If we're concerned with winning and we know trying something new is risky, that there's a chance of failure, well, we're less likely to try the original idea. Think of many Hollywood sequels and movies based on stories that have been successful books or comics. They're less risky. Novelty means uncertainty. Also, when we compete with others inside of our organization, we hold back knowledge and we hold back information. And therefore, it's kind of a creativity block for an entire group. The group suffers. B.F. Skinner and behaviorists showed how rewards reinforce behavior. But do rewards promote creative behavior? Amabile has demonstrated that external rewards and the promise of a reward undermine creative thinking. Again, a reward moves our focus to something that is external to the creator. Picture two mice racing through a maze. The one that gets out gets the reward, gets the cheese. Well, what if one mouse wants to explore, wants to find a different pathway, is curious about new, different corners, places that haven't been experienced yet, wants to take a more creative path? Well, this poor mouse won't ever get the reward. Time and time again, great creators say they create out of their own interest and pleasure. So let's review. Expected evaluation, competition, rewards, kill creativity. They erode our intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is fine for many tasks, but not for creativity. So what I recommend is that you avoid or downplay these situational factors and try not to impose them on others. At the beginning of this lecture, I defined creativity as the ability to overcome self-imposed constraints. Here's a story of one of the most prolific architects in American history, and he suffered from his own self-imposed constraints. In 1991, the American Institute of Architects recognized Frank Lloyd Wright as the greatest American architect of all time. Over his career, he created more than 1,000 designs, with approximately half of them being built. However, he was not always so productive. You see, during a 9-year period from 1924 to 1933, his production was akin to a slow dripping faucet. During this time, he completed 2 projects. Why the sudden change in his creative productivity when compared to the decades before? Author Adam Grant suggests it was due to the fact that he withdrew himself from exposure to other architects and craftsmen and sculptors. Exposure he had enjoyed when he worked in Chicago and Oak Park, Illinois. Very creative, productive decades. Apparently, during his middle period, he isolated himself, assuming he could excel alone. It would seem Frank Lloyd Wright didn't understand the value others brought to his creative process, stimulating his thinking, completing his concepts for him, making his designs work. So it would seem Frank Lloyd Wright found a way to impose constraints on himself. Thank goodness for his wife, who insisted that he begin a program for apprentices. Once he began this, his creative productivity soared again. What can we learn from Frank Lloyd Wright? Even superstar creators suffer from self-imposed constraints. Don't buy into your own creativity so much that you discount or neglect sources of inspiration and creative collaboration. Be aware of the conditions that promote your creativity. Blocks are serious matters, so I want to encourage you to do 3 things. Practice in and out thinking. Learn to leverage incubation breaks. Break up your creativity by injecting low-demand tasks. This can be done as a group as well. When running ideation sessions, it's useful to build in excursions, trips to museums, exercises, and some shopping. Pick another one of the 4 strategies for overcoming blocks. Make it a regular practice. Make it a routine, just like the great creators.